Ocean Wong, detonation. There's a joke that ends with, huh? It's the bomb saying, here is your father. Now here is your father inside your lungs. Look how lighter the earth is afterward. To even write father is to carve a portion of the day out of a bomb-bright page. There's enough light to drown, but never enough to enter the bones and stay. Don't stay here, he said, my boy, broken by the names of flowers. Don't cry anymore. So I ran into the night, my shadow growing toward my father. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The next event, I know, is well visited, and everybody was waiting to see Nathan THRALL and to hear about his book, A Day in the Life of Abed Salame, Anatomy of a Jerusalem Tragedy. With Nathan, Edina Bećirević will be speaking this evening. Have fun, enjoy.
Good evening, everybody. As you've heard, tonight's conversation is with Nathan THRALL, author of A Day in the Life of Abed Salame, Anatomy of a Jerusalem Tragedy. I'll say a few words about your previous professional biography. Nathan THRALL was a director of the Arab-Israeli project at the International Crisis Group, where he closely analyzed Israeli, Palestinian, and broader regional politics. He is also the author of The Only Language They Understand, Forcing Compromise in Israel and Palestine, published in 2017. His essays and reports have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Guardian, London Review of Books, and many other leading publications. Last year, Bible published the Bosnian translation of A Day in the Life of Abed Salame, a book that has been translated into more than 30 languages. I'll summarize some of the main critiques and some of the main reviews of a book. And they say that the book is expertly researched and profoundly moving. It reconstructs a tragic school bus accident in the West Bank in which 6 Palestinian children and their teacher were killed. The accident happened in February 2012. Nathan's book was published on October 3rd, 2023, and only 4 days later, October 7th happened. So in the aftermath of that, many of the events planned for the promotion of the book were cancelled in quite a few European capitals, and we're going to talk about that and many other things tonight. And yet in 2024, the book was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. Experts have highlighted the emotional depth and an amazing documentary, powerful documentary style narrative. It's actually, even though it's focused on a specific bus tragedy, it portrays a life under apartheid and a life under occupation. And it gets very clear shortly into the book that the accident is actually shaped by the logic and structure of the apartheid system. What stays with the reader is the moral clarity and literally strength, and it's combined with deep respect for the documentary form. So the story of occupation is told through the lives of ordinary people, and what I really liked about the book is the language is very precise and very, how to say, minimalist. There are few metaphors, but when they appear, they really cut deep. His narrative resists abstraction, remaining grounded in lived and painful experience. And also, in its heart, the book is also a love story. Now, I prepared a slightly longer introduction, but I must admit, whenever I attend book events or listen to interviews with authors, I'm always eager to hear what the author himself has to say about the book. So, Nathan, first of all, welcome to Sarajevo, welcome to Bookstan.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for that warm introduction.
And maybe we can start with the question why you choose this particular accident to center your book on it, and why it revolves around Abed and his son Milad, even though there are many other characters in the book, but the central to it are Abed and his son Milad.
Yeah. So, you know, at the time that I was writing and researching this book, there was a conceptual reframing of Israel-Palestine that was happening among experts all over the world. It was happening among legal scholars and happening among human rights organizations. And broadly speaking, that reframing was from discussing Israel-Palestine as a situation that we're used to hearing about as Israel is a democracy in good standing, allied with Europe and the United States, and beside it there is a temporary occupation that's very unfortunate, but it's outside the state of Israel, and it's going to eventually disappear. And we know that it's unsustainable, and eventually there will be a Palestinian state that will arise out of this occupation. And that was basically the framework that every mainstream journalist, every human rights organization, every diplomat in the West was using to describe Israel-Palestine. And after more than 50 years of this so-called unsustainable situation, people started to say, you know, this framework doesn't stand up. It's not temporary. It's lasted over half a century. It's not unsustainable. There's no end to this in sight. It's only getting deeper and deeper. Israel's taking over more and more land, constricting Palestinians into smaller and smaller spaces, and also this whole notion that the occupation is outside the state of Israel. What is this nonsense? There's one state. There's only one state there. One sovereign between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, controlling 7.5 million Jews, 7.5 million Palestinians, and the vast majority of those Palestinians are living without basic civil rights. Now, that's not a democracy under any definition of the term. And to say that it's somehow the occupation is separate from Israel, it's also nonsense. When you drive there, you drive from Tel Aviv to a settlement in the West Bank, you don't feel you crossed a border, you don't feel you left Israel, you travel on Israeli highways to get there, you enter the settlement, you see Israeli street signs, you see Israeli police stations and Israeli fire stations and Israeli health clinics and Israeli schools, and you're in Israel. And the whole world was talking about it as though this is some other place. It's, you know, like the American occupation of Iraq, some distant thing outside of the US. No, this is inside Israel, and there's one state controlling all these people, dominating them, depriving them of rights based on their ethnicity. There's only one description for what that is, and it's apartheid. And while that reframing was happening among intellectuals and scholars and human rights activists, you know, I was frustrated by the inability of people to really grasp what those scholars and human rights activists and international lawyers were saying. And what I really felt was needed was for people to just have a sense of what does it actually mean to live under apartheid? Not in abstraction, not in terms of how does it meet the definition of apartheid in international law, but just what does it mean for Palestinians to live under this system of domination? What is the ordinary life of people under this system? And that was really the primary aim with this book. And for me, when I came to the main character of the book, Abed Salame, and I came to his home and he told me about this accident and how he arrived at the scene of this tragic bus accident, that his son was on this bus and all of the children were gone by the time he got there. There was a huge crowd. There was a burned out shell of a bus. And he asked people in the crowd, where are the children? And they said, they're at a hospital in East Jerusalem, they're at a hospital in West Jerusalem, they're at the military base, the Israeli military base, 1 minute up the road, they're at the hospital in Ramallah, they're at the hospital in Nablus. Now, Abed himself, he had a green West Bank ID. He could not travel through the checkpoints to go and look if his son was at most of these places. He couldn't enter the military base. He couldn't go into East Jerusalem. He couldn't go into West Jerusalem. And so he went to the one place that he could go, which was the hospital in Ramallah. And he called on relatives who had a different color ID, who live in the same neighborhood as him, but they have blue IDs instead of green, so they could go through the checkpoint, and they could look for his son at these hospitals. And as he's telling minute by minute what happened to him, and it took more than 24 hours for him to find his son, just to find what happened to son, where his son was, he was describing walking through apartheid. He was describing walking through a segregated road system, through a permit system, through a system of checkpoints. And then his life story was the story of the occupation. And so it was just so obvious to me that anybody listening to Abed speak would have a deeper understanding of apartheid than reading all of these very valuable hundreds of pages of reports by various human rights organizations.
Since October 7/23, over 17,000 children were killed in Gaza. It's impossible not to notice when reading the book how book, even though it writes about the accident from 2012, it so closely speaks to this moment. What I found striking is that a few parents and children from your story had a feeling prior to that school trip that something terrible is going to happen. Now you can look at it as a superstition, but really, I think you made it clear that it's more like generational intuition, shaped by the life of apartheid. Intuition that danger is never far away and death is so close. Like, it's really moving, this little boy Salah's obsession with death. I found that really particularly disturbing. He does get killed. But he also is the victim of the accident. And I wonder, as a writer, when you were researching, doing interviews, and also when you were writing the book, could you also, I mean, I can't say did you have a feeling or a sense, but could you also sense that violence would escalate further?
Yes. You know, it has always been my basic assumption that, you know, violence ebbs and flows, but violence will come back regularly, so long as this system of ethnic domination remains in place. And I didn't see the system going anywhere. I saw it getting only more oppressive. So it was obvious to me that for sure there would be greater violence. Did I imagine that it would be at the scale that we have seen in Gaza? I did not. I didn't think that it would be at that scale. But for sure there is an expectation, a constant expectation, that there is going to be violence. And that's also one of the things that the book aims to show, is that, you know, we think about violence in Israel-Palestine in terms of when it reaches the front pages of our newspapers, when there's a real spike in many, many deaths in Gaza or somewhere else, and we tend to hear much less about, and tend to ignore ourselves, the daily violence that's happening. There is daily violence that's happening to Palestinians, because any system of oppression like this requires tremendous violence in order to maintain the system. You know, one of the primary mechanisms of maintaining control is coming and arresting young men. And you know, one of the characters in the book is a mother, Huda, yeah, who has to raise a boy in these circumstances. And of course, boys, you know, that are being harassed by soldiers outside their school every day by Israeli soldiers, you know, they reach a certain age and they're going to start throwing stones at these tanks. It's meaningless. It doesn't do anything to the tanks. It doesn't even dent them. But Israel comes in the middle of the night and takes 12-year-old boys, 13-year-old boys, scared to death, peeing in their pants, out of their homes, throws them in a facility, doesn't tell their parents where they are. Sometimes it takes them a week just to find out where the kid is. And this is the terror that parents are living with every night. They have the fear of, and not just the arrest, but that the kid makes the wrong move or the parent makes the wrong move, and the soldier shoots. And so that fear is very warranted, and it pervades your life if you live under those circumstances.
I'd also like to mention that in one of your interviews you mentioned that prior to October 7th, thousands of Palestinian Bedouins were displaced and hundreds killed. And this, in a way, what does this often erase prehistory of violence to prior to October 7th, tells us that the trajectory of violence Israel was on prior to October 7th.
Yes.
Of that escalation.
Yes.
Say.
So people often, you know, again, this speaks to the slow motion, daily violence of the state of Israel against Palestinians that's ignored. You know, people weren't aware that prior to October 7th, there was a huge spike in the killing of Palestinians in the West Bank. Not just Bedouin, but all kinds of Palestinians in the West Bank, and that more than 1,000 Bedouin were forcibly displaced, entire communities removed in the 18 months prior to October 7th, and that was also a big spike in forced transfer, as Israel calls it, and so in terms of the trajectory that Israel is on, one of the things people tend not to appreciate is that, yes, this has been going on for decades, and if we look on a timeline and we just see year by year expansion of Israeli takeover of Palestinian land, constriction of Palestinians into smaller and smaller spaces, walls and fences around these Palestinians, greater restrictions on their movement. That process has been going on for decades, but it's not a linear process. It's accelerating. The pace that it's going at now is unprecedented. It's moving at warp speed right now. You know, in the year after October 7th, Israel confiscated more Palestinian land in the West Bank than in the previous 20 years combined. So this is a process that's on overdrive. And if we're talking about trajectories, the trajectory is for, you know, total takeover for Israel and the fate of the Palestinians looking like the Native Americans. And it's up to us it's up to many people, but it's also up to us to do much, much more to stop that. Because if things continue as they are, and if people are just moving at a tiny little pace, and you know, we're just taking these small measures, Ireland, for the first time ever in Europe, is introducing a bill to remove settlement products from the shelves of stores in Ireland. I mean, this is something that should have happened decades ago. And this is the first time, it hasn't even happened yet. It will be the first time in Europe. So at this pace that Israel is moving, and at this very slow and minimal pace that the forces of opposition to what Israel is doing are moving, there's no stopping Israel.
I might have mentioned, but quite a few reviews also say that your book reads like a novel. And I noticed that you intentionally, it seems to me, avoided artful stylizations, as if you wanted to pay respect to those personal stories, and to pay respect to the people who trusted you with your personal stories. I mean, I'm wondering, how did you find the right measure of emotional restraint?
Yes.
And also, how was it for you emotionally to listen to those stories firsthand? How did you process this?
Yeah. So I think for me, there were a combination of factors behind that decision, and one of them I appreciate you saying was to respect and honor those stories and to tell them as accurately as possible. But it was also my feeling that the facts of not just this story, but the Palestinian story, the facts of the situation in Israel-Palestine, and certainly the facts of this particular tragedy, are so devastating. They speak for themselves. And if I were to embellish, if I were to add extra emphasis or weight and really note for the reader, it wasn't this terrible, it would only weaken it, actually. It's the strongest possible means of conveying this tragedy was with minimalism. And in terms of the emotional experience of speaking with these people, I often would have tears in my eyes as I was hearing these stories. I would come back after a day of reporting and I would tell my wife what I had heard. I would just retell the stories that I heard as I remember them, and she would be weeping. And a big part of what that restraint was also, I have a lot of anger about the situation, and I think that it's much less effective for me to express that anger than to suppress it and to really channel it into just describing things as accurately as I can, because I have faith that the bare facts of the matter are devastating in themselves.
Okay, something else about the research and the writing process. I'd like to ask you something else. As I was reading your book, another book perhaps unexpectedly came to mind. That's Hasan Ohanovic's book, The Last Refuge, about the war and survival under the siege of Srebrenica. He also balances political and personal, basically uses, it's a memoir. He uses his private life to tell much larger tragedy. In the same way, I think Abed's stories and his love life and personal life also serve to say that within the occupation and apartheid system, there is no such thing as personal. Every little decision in your private life is tainted, yes, by the political. But also, Hasan wrote his memoir, but you told Abed's story. Yes. How did you navigate that discomfort of telling someone else's personal life? Was Abed entirely comfortable
Yeah.
with that part of the book, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about that rapport between, and friendship, obviously, between you and Abed, how that developed.
Yeah. In the research for the book, I spent more time with Abed than with anyone else, and we spent more time with one another than with anyone outside of our nuclear families. And you know, many of the discussions that we had went beyond just a normal interview. I mean, it was almost like, you know, therapy at some points. And you know, the general practice, it's not always the case, but the general practice for, particularly for, I think, American journalists, is you would never show the subject of a piece of journalism to you'd never show the piece to the subject. And there are obvious reasons, you know, it's just natural, it's human, you want to try and change how you would appear, you would want to try and litigate this thing and that thing. And I was very pleased with how the manuscript was. I didn't want to have to change things, I didn't want to have to litigate things. And Abed knew more or less what was in the book from my fact-checking, from my calling him over and over again and asking about this detail and that detail, so-and-so said this, and checking every little detail of the book. But still, it bothered me because this is such an intimate story, and it's not just intimate in terms of his son, it's and his emotion, it's about his love lives and his community, and so I wondered if this was an exception, that this was a case where maybe I owed it to him to give him a chance to read the book before, to read the manuscript and to give me feedback. And I went back and forth on this question of whether I should do it for quite a while. And in the end, I decided I didn't want to do it. I was just going to let him know what was in the book through the fact-checking process, and he could ask me anything, and I can ask him anything, but I wasn't going to let him try and go and edit the manuscript. And so I didn't give him the book until it was too late, until I received the hardcover. And I got the first 2 copies of the hardcover a month before the book came out. And the first thing I did is I called him, and I came and I met him and I gave him the book. And a day later, he called me, and he and I have become very good friends. We're good friends already at this point, and now even more so. And he called me a day later, and he said, I read part 1 of the book. The book has 5 parts. The first part is really, it's about his love lives more than anything else. And he said, you know, I read part 1 of the book, and I have to say, you know, I knew that you were going to put in a lot of details, but I didn't realize there would be this many details. And he said, you know, I'm going to be in a lot of trouble in my community because, you know, I'm revealing how my sister-in-law betrayed me. I never confronted her in my life, but here it is in this book. I'm revealing, you know, how my first love hated the man she wound up marrying and wrote me letters about how much she didn't respect him. And all of these things that have never been aired, and how he feels about the main political party in the town, and so many things that could get him in trouble. And I said, you know, this is like the worst reaction I could imagine. This is my worst nightmare. I've been losing sleep for months, worrying about exactly this phone call. Can you please just finish the book and let's talk after that, not just after you read part 1. Believe it or not, there are other people who tell even more intimate details of their lives. And so then I just didn't sleep for 2 or 3 nights until he called me again, and he finished the book, and he said, I understand now why you did what you did, why those details are there, and I accept it, and I embrace it. I hugged the book when I finished it, like it was my son, Milad, and he's been a huge supporter. He wants everyone to read it, and he's ready for anyone in his community to come to him. He feels it's his story to tell, and he has a right to tell it. And there's no one who's actually more happy about the book reaching people than him.
Okay, there are also Israeli characters in the book. There's this interesting character, Danny Tirza. He's the architect, helped build the wall. And you do stress this cognitive dissonance in his mind about his role. He sees himself, I mean, he's somebody who builds the wall, but he sees himself as someone who contributed to peace.
Yes.
How did that interview go?
Yeah.
How did you approach him and how he agreed to give you an interview?
I'm quite sure that if Danny had bothered to do a Google search before I came, he wouldn't have agreed to an interview. But he's a person who really likes to talk. He's very proud of his views and his contributions to Israeli security, and so it was actually a very easy, interview, because he just loves to talk, and I did not, of course, he didn't ask, and I didn't need to tell him, what I'm trying to do, what my greater project is. I told him I'm writing about this accident, and I wanted to hear about the wall, which was so central to his life. He's the architect of the wall, and so central to the lives of the people who were involved in this accident, or who live behind that wall.
But have you heard any feedback from Danny Tirza after the book was published? And generally, I'd like to hear what was the reception and reactions to your book in Israel?
I have not heard from Danny. My guess is probably he has not read it yet. The book is now being translated into Hebrew, so I think a lot of those reactions are still to come, particularly from the Israelis who are in the book. And my expectation is that the reaction of Israelis will be very negative. Israelis don't like to hear any criticism of their policies. I did receive one review. I've received reviews in English language Israeli papers, and I've received one review in Hebrew in Haaretz, the more liberal newspaper, and that was one of the most insightful reviews of the book. But it's still to be seen what the Israeli reactions will be.
Okay. Well, as I said, your book was published just after a couple of days prior to October 7th, and a couple of events were cancelled. But then you got Pulitzer. Have some doors been open in the West after that, and has maybe the reception of the book in some of the cultural institutions that were refusing to promote it before, has it changed, maybe not only because of the Pulitzer, but because of what followed after October 7th, after Israeli genocidal attacks in Gaza? Has the perception changed?
Basically, I want to say no. I think that, of course, having the Pulitzer does, I think, make it less likely that I'll have events canceled in the future. But, most of those institutions that canceled events, that me and Abed were on tour together in the US and the UK, and we had a number, about a fourth of the events we had planned were canceled. None of those institutions have come back said, you know, because after October 7th, they said, oh, we have to cancel, we can't do it now, now's not the right time. None of them came back and said, okay, now it's 2 years later, now we see there's a genocide, now. No, none of them have come back, and I don't think any of them would host me today, or host me and Abed today. And I think that, you know, what your question touches on is there is this global shift in public opinion watching what's happening in Gaza. But in parallel, and I think that this is something that we don't pay as much attention to, in parallel to that shift in public opinion, there is a reaction among the gatekeepers, among an older generation, among the heads of these institutions, among, you know, the kinds of people who canceled the events that I had, that has been in the opposite direction. They have moved to the right, and they have moved even further toward a kind of Israel, no matter what, Israel right or wrong, we stand with Israel. And so, yeah, I don't really think that it's fundamentally changed how I'm received. I certainly don't have much more invitations to speak in the United States as a result of the Pulitzer.
Yeah. Well, not much has changed, and one of the letters signed by 100 BBC employees published, was it 2 or 3 days ago? They said that it's 100 and something journalists accusing the BBC editorial board and the director of being acting as the PR for the Israeli government and military in coverage of the Israel-Gaza conflict. This war was terrible, is terrible for journalists. More than 230 journalists, mainly Palestinians, were killed in Gaza since the beginning of the war, since the beginning of the genocide. But really, it's the deadliest conflict for journalists in modern history. Do you think that there's been enough solidarity among international media for Palestinian journalists, and you know, can you view that in the context of this letter written to the BBC?
Yeah, absolutely not. I don't. I think that it's been shameful, the degree to which. I hope no one's getting wet. Yeah. I think we can get rid of this aisle so people can stay dry.
I think we can continue.
Okay, so you know, the absence of solidarity from many of the journalists in the world and in the West has been shameful, and you know, all the time I'm always asked questions about, you know, well, there are no journalists in Gaza. There are a lot of journalists in Gaza doing excellent work. The international media isn't allowed into Gaza right now, but for many people it's like, if CNN, if the Western reporters aren't there, there are no reporters there. And you know, one of my very close friends and a colleague of many years is a journalist in Gaza, and one of the most heartbreaking things he was telling me during this genocide was that he's well known and people recognize him. They know he's a journalist. And when he would go out in Gaza, people would stay away from him. And people he knew stayed away from him because they feared for their lives, and they thought he could be targeted by a drone or some projectile at any moment, and they would be standing next to him and be killed. And so the people of Gaza knew that journalists are targeted, and they stayed away from them because of that.
They have to share their GPS coordinates with IDF and then get targeted. So it's like basically that sentence.
And the IDF has their cell phone numbers and knows where all of them are and can locate them with the cell phones. It's, yes.
What do ordinary people, you live in Israel, what do ordinary people think about what's going on in Gaza, about genocide in Gaza? Do they sympathize?
The vast majority of Israelis have one concern with respect to Gaza, and that is the release of the remaining hostages. There is very, very little concern in Israel for the lives of Palestinians in Gaza, and this notion that there are no innocents in Gaza is extremely widespread, not just among the right wing, among the center and self-identified center-left. There are more and more voices that are coming out against the war. That is happening now, but it's an argument about futility. It's about why are we waking up every week and finding more Israeli soldiers who are dead? And why are the hostages still not released? It's not, why are we killing people waiting in line for flour? And so, I mean, that's been consistent throughout.
Do you have any hope that things might change for the better? I mean, I have to admit I'm not big on crying when reading books. I'm used to reading really difficult material, but when I reached the acknowledgement, one sentence caught me off guard. When you said that you don't think during your lifetime that the just solution is on the way, but that you still hold hope for the generation of your daughters. Yes. Still, can you tell us, what do you think might happen in the nearest future?
In the near future, it's possible that there will be a ceasefire. It's possible there will be a ceasefire that will again be broken by Israel, like the last one. It's possible there will be a ceasefire that will last much longer. But at the end of the day, Israel is going to control Gaza, whether from inside or outside, just as they controlled it before October 7th. And they are going to continue expanding Israeli settlements. They're going to keep the system of apartheid in place. They're going to keep Palestinians living under a system of domination. And there is going to be this looming threat over Palestinians that's much more real than it has ever been since 1948 and since 1967 of mass expulsion. There's slow motion, low scale expulsion. There's ethnic cleansing that's happening locally in the West Bank all the time. But a mass expulsion, as is approved by the President of the United States, it has whet the appetite of many in Israel. And at the end of the day, most Israelis recognize that either they're going to continue with apartheid indefinitely, or the state of Israel is going to collapse, or they're going to have to expel the Palestinians. And so I think it's something that was suppressed, a kind of something in the Israeli id about this kind of future expulsion that's now out in the open. And I think everybody is rightfully worried about what that's going to lead to.
Yeah, on this worrying note, I think it's time to give an opportunity to the audience to ask questions. I know there were quite few interested people. So how do we go about this, Mike?
Hi, thank you very much. This was so amazing to hear from you directly. I'm from an organization that probably writes many of these reports in coded diplomatic language, so it's really good to meet the person who brings it all to life. But I was just wondering, based on your experience of living in Israel, what is the situation now of the Arab community in Israel? So I'm talking about people in Nazareth, in Haifa, and so on. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. For the minority of Palestinians living under Israeli control who have Israeli citizenship, those who are living in the Galilee and Nazareth and in the Negev, they are facing, since October 7th, an atmosphere of heightened repression. There are people who have been arrested for liking the wrong thing on social media. There have been cultural events that have been shut down, and in general, they're continuing to face a more sanitized version of what Palestinians in the West Bank are facing, which is to say, you're not allowed to build, you're surrounded by Jewish communities that are expanding while you're not allowed to grow. Your homes are demolished because you're forced to build without a permit because the permits aren't given. And so that system is very much in place, and you have Palestinian citizens of Israel are afraid. They're afraid because they see these public opinion polls in Israel that repeatedly are showing, not just a slight majority, but the majority of Israelis say they are in favor of forcible expulsion. We didn't have public opinion polls saying that a couple of years ago. And poll after poll after poll is showing it. And so, and Israelis are not making, fine distinctions between Palestinians who have citizenship and Palestinians who don't. They're all Arabs. And so I think that the Palestinian citizens of Israel are very fearful, rightfully so, and they're keeping their heads down for the most part.
So first of all, thank you for amplifying Palestinian voices, because I think that's very necessary. As you mentioned, there are no journalists in Palestine or in Israel. Of course they are, but they are unfortunately Palestinians. My question actually refers to your last question about hope. I share your lack of hope when it comes to the situation in Israel, because there is this mentality of dehumanization of Palestinians. But I think we need to step away from the wood in order to see individual trees. What I'm interested in is, do we have hope about other political forces supporting Israel in this apartheid regime, especially, for example, the United States or the UK, because Israel is not doing this on its own, but with a very heavy political and military support of big forces. So what is your opinion on that? Because maybe that might be the key. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very good question. I think that there is reason to have some hope of generational change in the UK and the US. but it's a very long-term hope, and it's kind of abstract. It's basically, there is this generational change. These students who are forming the encampments will have some kind of political influence, some kind of political power. In 20, 25 years, they'll be in positions of power, and there is a hope that they will behave differently. But that's a very incremental thing. It's a very, as I say, and it's an abstract hope. The fact of the matter is, the kinds of things that are being debated and discussed in terms of policy in the United States are still so narrow and so tiny. I mean, even this Irish measure, which is welcome. And long overdue. Just the other day, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the United States, he spoke out against the Irish measure and said, we're going to have to reevaluate our relationship with Ireland if they go through with this. And do I think that Ireland could succumb to that kind of pressure from the U.S.? I do. So it's a very long road. Yeah.
Okay, so, well, good evening. Thank you very much for coming to Sarajevo. I took the microphone in my real necessity to speak in like threefold person. Firstly, as a passionate reader, I read your book as soon as they published it here in Sarajevo, and then as a diplomat of 32 years of Bosnia and Herzegovina abroad, and then as a daughter of a really famous Bosnian poet. So I loved your book. I congratulate you on it, and I also congratulate you for, of course, for the Pulitzer Award that you got. I don't have any questions really, because everything you wrote, you already gave us all the answers. But I just wonder if I was reading something that we already knew in late 80s or early 90s, because this was obvious to us what was coming, all the divisions in the city, in the country of Yugoslavia and then Bosnia and Herzegovina. But what I'm afraid of, and you, I think, just mentioned briefly that you yourself are not very optimistic, that your book is like a dystopian picture of our future, of dystopian future of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I don't see, unfortunately, anything better than you depicted in the one day of the life of Abed Salame, what will happen to us here in Sarajevo. But anyways, I'm really thrilled to see you here with us. I'm really grateful that you came to share and to promote your book here in the Bookstán Festival. That's really magnificent, and you are really the star of the festival. Thank you very much for coming here to share with us, and I hope that everybody will really read this book.
Well, thank you.
And to read your next books too.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's funny that you mention if anything has changed, if there's anything that we could see now that we didn't see in the 80s. And I used to work for the International Crisis Group, and part of my job was to talk to diplomats who are stationed in Israel-Palestine. And usually the stint is for 3 or 4 years, and there's a typical pattern where they come, they want to have a first meeting, and they just want to talk, generally about to learn as much as they can. What do you recommend that I read, etc. And in those meetings, I would often recommend to the diplomats books from the 80s. And they would be so depressed when I recommended books from the 80s. They said, "Oh, I came here to make a change. You're telling me nothing has changed. It's all the same. It's continuing." And that is the truth of the matter. I mean, there's an acceleration, there's an intensification. Things are much worse than they have been, but those basic principles are still in place, and they're still governing the reality.
Can I? Yeah. I was wondering about something. I'm a little bit more optimistic than the nice lady in the front. I was just thinking, living in Europe and looking at the United States, I feel like there is a current of more sympathy for the Palestinian cause, especially on the American left, but even on the libertarian right to some extent. And as somebody who I assume speaks at these kind of things, to what extent do you feel like, I mean, could you give a percentage? I mean, there are people in Congress now, after all, who voice sympathy for it, and again, I'm a bit of an optimist, so I was just wondering to what extent you feel that that's an emerging moment.
Yeah. As I say, I do have some kind of a very long-term optimism about change in the United States, but you know, if we actually look at what has a chance of passing, you know, what the balance of power is, just to put it in the most blunt terms, I mean, even the Democratic Party, it's still the case today, despite all of what we've seen in the last, however many, is it 21 months now, it's still the case that among Democrats, AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby that has never disagreed with Netanyahu on anything, they're the strongest force among the Democrats. I mean, they're much stronger than J Street among Democrats, and I'm not even talking about about the groups that aren't pro-Israel that are actually calling for more serious measures. But just looking at like the light pro-Israel group J Street and the strong pro-Israel group AIPAC's still the strongest one among the left. So that's where we are today in terms of actual power and politics in the US. But I agree with you that there are reasons, there are glimmers of hope. You know, there's a mayor in New York City, a mayoral Democratic primary in New York City that was won by somebody who came out and openly said, I don't believe Israel should be a Jewish state. I believe in equal rights. I believe that every state should give equal protection to all its citizens, equal rights and privileges to all its citizens independent of their ethnicity. And he was asked about it over and over again, and he didn't back down. And he won the primary. So there are these glimmers of hope, but it's a long-term change. It's happening, but in terms of actual political power, it's still quite small.
Yes, if I may. America and the Jews in America has been spoken about. There's been a brief reference to the letter which appeared 3 or 4 days ago, signed by a host of BBC journalists, but anonymously, which is sad in itself, even if one understands why, but also by 4 members of the executive of an important Jewish institution in the UK. And those 4 members have been suspended pending investigation to determine whether they have brought the institution into disrepute. You have, since the publication of the book, had some fora cancelled, but you have been able to speak at a number, I don't know how many, venues. Were any hosted by a Jewish body?
Yes, I did. I have spoken at Jewish institutions. I've spoken at a synagogue. I have spoken to Jewish organizations, but also Jewish organizations were behind many of the cancellations, and there, again, there is a generational change among diaspora Jews in the U.S. and the U.K. But I still think it's much smaller than it needs to be. Let's put it that way. If we look at mainstream prominent commentators, even from a younger generation in the U.S., there's still basically kind of a knee-jerk no matter what, the thing that can never be questioned is Israel must exist as a Jewish state, whatever the costs, and it must retain 78% of historic Palestine, and the only thing up for discussion is how much of the 22 remaining percent, that's the occupied territories, will be given to the Palestinians in some kind of potentially state-like arrangement. And the kinds of views that you heard from the mayoral candidate I just mentioned, Mamdani, those are not really being uttered by prominent leaders of Jewish institutions. They do exist in places, and it's growing, but institutionally, it's almost non-existent.
Are there any more questions? Okay, let's take one more question.
Thank you. It's been really interesting. Coming from South Africa, we saw apartheid end before anyone thought it was going to end. And I do have more hope as well. I think the sick death cult that is Zionism it's done, right? It cannot go back to where it is anymore, and it's done this to itself. But I want to know, what is Abed's view, like speaking to him these days? What is his view for the future? Like, what is his hope? Does he have hope?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Before I say what his view is, I'll just say there is a popular view on the left that this is the beginning of the end of Israel, or the beginning of the end of Zionism. And I don't hold that view. I understand why people think that, but in my view, I see Israel just moving from one success to another. And they are euphoric after bombing Iran. They feel almost zero consequences. We can talk about public opinion, and okay, there are crowds in Europe, but Israelis are moving about the world. They are doing business. They are having normal trade relations. They have their allies in the EU who will prevent any kind of serious measure taken against them. There is some tiny, very small incremental process that maybe in 10 years we'll see some result from international justice mechanisms. But again, that's going to attack 2, 4, 5 figures who are alive today. And so again, in terms of actual practice, the state of Israel it's expanding Israeli Jewish settlements every day at a rate like it's never done before, and Palestinians are as weak and defenseless as they've ever been, despite this surge in public opinion in the West. And so I really don't see Israel being vulnerable in that way at present. Abed has a very different view. He is very hopeful. And he's always been hopeful. He's much more hopeful than I am. And I would say most Palestinians I know are much more hopeful than I am. I don't know how much of that hope is a way that you have to be living under those conditions. I remember being depressed one day, just driving through the West Bank and seeing all of this massive infrastructure that Israel has created that just in the time I've lived there that didn't exist before. Multi-lane highways that are going to really expand Israeli Jewish presence in the West Bank, because if you make the commute time small, then it's cheaper and you can have big numbers move there, and it's just like suburbanization is essentially what the means of really increasing the number of Israeli Jewish settlers. And I was depressed, and I'm looking at all of this massive infrastructure and building and construction everywhere, and I was just thinking how hopeless this all is, and it's actually actively, quickly moving in the opposite direction that all my working life I've been hoping that it would move. And I met with a Palestinian friend, and And he said, yeah, well, you know, it's a very short term what you're saying, you know. There have been 37 occupations of Jerusalem. This is the latest one. It'll pass. And so I think that when you're in a really bad situation, often you have to have that very long-term kind of thinking, and you can have hope. And I can have hope if I think centuries in the future. But anyway, Abed has hope.
I guess hope is needed for what you need to survive in those circumstances. This doesn't work.
I think struggle is needed, not hope, struggle. Because Western democracy is totally compromised. Western civilization is totally compromised in our eyes.
I agree with you.
Yeah. Then struggle and hope. Nathan, thank you very much. This was it was a great conversation.
For me as well, thank you.
Heavy topic. Didn't really leave us with too much hope, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming and enduring the rain.
Nathan will be signing the book here.